Rocky Mountain Mining Camp, February 1899. While every miner in the gulch stacked cord after cord of firewood outside their 12 by 14-foot cabins, one bricklayer turned miner was running stovepipe under his bunk. His bunkmates called it wasteful. They called him crazy. Instead of the standard setup, straight pipe up through the roof, he salvaged 3 extra sections and built what looked like an underground maze of hot metal beneath his sleeping platform. He used the same amount of firewood as everyone else, but claimed his bed would stay warm all night without constant feeding. The other miners couldn't believe such backward thinking. Then the record cold of February 1899 hit the Rockies. Temperatures plunged to 20 below zero and stayed there for weeks. Standard cabins required men to wake twice each night just to keep from freezing. But that bricklayer's bunk? He slid a thermometer under his blankets at dawn, 48 degrees. Then he hung another by the cabin door, 8 degrees. A 40-degree difference, and he could prove it with numbers. What did he understand about waste heat, thermal mass, and radiant warming that made sleeping on hot pipes work when conventional heating failed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The bunk measured 6 feet 6 inches by 4 feet, standard 2-man proportions in a mining camp where every square inch of heated space cost firewood. At 4:30 in the morning, with the stove still glowing from its last feeding 3 hours earlier, Thomas Kellerman slid the cheap spirit thermometer under his wool blankets and waited. The mercury settled at 48 degrees. He pulled on his boots, walked the 8 steps to the cabin door, and hung a second thermometer on the nail where the other men checked the weather each dawn. 8 degrees above zero. 40 degrees difference between his sleep pocket and the cabin air, measured with instruments any man could verify. The other miners had been calling his setup foolish for 2 months. Now they hovered around his bunk like moths drawn to the only warm light in a cold room. Kellerman had built what the camp called a waste of good pipe. While every other cabin in the gulch ran their stovepipes straight up through the roof, the fastest way to clear smoke and the easiest to repair when joints failed, he had salvaged 3 extra sections from a wrecked setup and routed them in a long horizontal run beneath his sleeping platform. The modification looked like madness to men who trusted simple solutions, but the numbers told a different story every morning. The cabin itself was nothing special. 12 feet by 14 feet with a 7-foot ceiling, chinked with mud and moss like every other rough shelter in the district. The air volume was tiny, which made drafts matter and heat loss visible within minutes of letting a fire die down. Every man in camp knew the arithmetic of survival. 1 armload of split wood weighed 25 to 35 pounds, and every trip outside after dark meant frostbite risk on exposed skin. The standard practice was to bank coals at bedtime and pray they lasted until dawn, but most nights required at least 1 middle-of-the-night feeding to keep water buckets from freezing solid. Kellerman's bunk sat differently than the others. Instead of resting on simple log supports, his sleeping platform covered a shallow masonry channel he had built during 2 evenings after shift and 1 Sunday afternoon. The channel measured 10 inches high by 18 inches wide, running 6 feet beneath the length of his mattress. He had sealed it with flat stones and clay mud, creating what looked like an underground flue that connected his stove to a chimney exit on the far wall instead of directly overhead. The mockery had started immediately. Jim Harwick, the shift foreman who had survived 15 winters in mining camps, called it foreign nonsense. "You're trying to sleep on smoke," he told anyone who would listen. "Straight pipe up is straight pipe up for a reason. Hot gases want to rise, not crawl sideways under a man's bed." The other miners agreed with the logic of conventional wisdom. A stove worked by burning hot and venting fast. The shorter the path from firebox to sky, the stronger the draft and the cleaner the burn. Adding horizontal runs meant more places for soot to collect, more joints to leak, and more chances for backdraft when wind hit the chimney wrong. Experienced men had seen cabins fill with smoke when owners got creative with their pipe routes, but Kellerman had seen something different during his years as a bricklayer's helper before the mines. Greenhouse owners ran long flues under their growing benches to keep plants alive through winter, capturing heat that would otherwise disappear up the stack. The principle was simple. Hot metal radiates warmth into whatever touches it, and masonry holds that warmth long after the fire dies down. He had also listened to the Chinese cook at the railroad camp describe heated sleeping platforms where fire burned in one location, but warmth appeared where families slept, with the chimney positioned far from the firebox to pull draft through internal passages. The test had been running for 8 weeks now, through the normal cold of a Rocky Mountain winter. Every morning, Kellerman posted the same readings. Cabin air between 5 and 15 degrees above zero, sleep pocket between 45 and 50 degrees. The difference was consistent enough that men started gathering to watch the daily measurement, some hoping to see the trick fail, and others beginning to wonder if the bricklayer had stumbled onto something worth copying. The real proof came in fuel consumption. While his bunkmates woke twice each night, to feed their stoves, Kellerman slept through until dawn without adding wood. His slow, steady burn lasted longer because the extended flue path extracted more usable heat from each piece of split pine before the gases escaped to the sky. The heated stones beneath his mattress worked like a radiator, releasing stored warmth for hours after the stove settled into coals. On the coldest nights, when exterior temperatures dropped to 20 below zero and standard cabins showed frost lines 3 feet up their interior walls, Kellerman's setup maintained its advantage. His frost line held at 1 foot, and his hand stayed functional at dawn, a survival detail that mattered more than comfort when a man needed to grip an axe handle or operate machinery at first light. The shift foreman watched the daily readings with growing interest, though he continued to warn others about the dangers of modified flue systems. "Heat's heat," he admitted privately to Kellerman, "but smoke kills faster than cold does." The concern was legitimate. Poor draft could fill a cabin with carbon monoxide in minutes, and sloppy pipe joints had burned down more than one mining district shelter. Yet the system worked with mechanical reliability that impressed even the skeptics. Every morning brought the same 40-degree advantage, measured and recorded like any other piece of camp data. The innovation had turned what others called waste heat into the warmest sleeping surface in the gulch, and February 1899 was about to test every heating system in the district beyond its designed limits. Jim Harwick had built his reputation on 15 years of keeping miners alive through mountain winters, and his rule was ironclad. Short flue, strong draft, get the smoke out fast. "Long pipes are fool pipes," he told the men gathered around the mess table after Kellerman posted another 40-degree reading. "You start routing heat all over creation, you get backdraft. Backdraft fills a cabin with poison gas, and poison gas kills you deader than cold ever will." The foreman's logic followed standard frontier practice that had kept countless cabins from burning down or filling with carbon monoxide. Hot gases wanted to rise, and the shortest path from stove to sky meant the strongest natural draft. Every additional foot of horizontal pipe created resistance. Every elbow joint collected soot, and every connection point could leak smoke back into living space when mountain winds hit the chimney wrong. Harwick had seen men die from creative heating solutions that worked for a week, then failed catastrophically. But Kellerman had learned different principles during his years around commercial heating systems. At the brick kilns outside Denver, he had watched firemen route exhaust gases through long flue networks to dry lumber and heat workspace before venting to the atmosphere. The principle was heat recovery, capturing thermal energy that would otherwise escape unused. In the greenhouse district, growers ran stovepipes under growing benches in serpentine patterns, wringing every possible British thermal unit from expensive coal before letting gases exit through the roof. The physics were straightforward once a man understood what was happening inside the pipe. Hot exhaust gases carried enormous amounts of thermal energy, but standard cabin setups threw that energy away by venting it directly to the sky. A 6-inch diameter stovepipe running straight up moved gases at temperatures often exceeding 400 degrees Fahrenheit. That superheated air represented fuel value that most miners literally sent up in smoke. Kellerman's extended flue path changed the equation by forcing those hot gases to travel 16 feet instead of the standard 6 feet before reaching open air. The additional 10 feet of pipe contact allowed radiant heat transfer into the masonry channel beneath his bunk, where stones absorbed and stored thermal energy like a battery. The system worked on the same principle as the massive masonry stoves used in European farmhouses, where a single hot fire heated stones that radiated warmth for 12 to 18 hours. The Chinese railroad cook Wang Li had described similar logic when Kellerman asked about heated sleeping platforms. Fire burns here, Wang had explained, pointing to one corner of an imaginary room, but warm bed is there, pointing to the opposite corner. The ondol system used in Korean homes routed hot gases through stone passages beneath living surfaces, with the chimney positioned far from the firebox to create draft that pulled heat through the entire network before exhaust escaped. Wang's description matched what Kellerman had built, though his version was simpler and smaller. The key insight was thermal mass, heating stone and masonry that would hold warmth long after the fire died down, instead of trying to heat air that disappeared the moment it escaped through cracks and gaps. You heat air, air goes away, Wang had said. You heat stone, stone stays warm. The difference showed in fuel consumption patterns that any miner could calculate. Harwick's standard setup required constant feeding to maintain cabin temperature because it heated air directly, and heated air escaped through every gap in the rough construction. On a typical 20 below night, his stove needed 2 full reloads between bedtime and dawn to keep interior temperature above freezing. Each reload meant getting up, opening the firebox, adding split wood, adjusting dampers, and waiting for the new fuel to catch. 15 minutes of work while standing in a cabin that had already cooled to dangerous levels. Kellerman's system operated differently because it heated mass instead of air. His initial fire heated the gases that traveled through the underbed channel, and those gases transferred their thermal energy into the stone lining before exiting through the far chimney. The heated stones continued radiating warmth for hours after the stove settled to coals, maintaining surface temperatures that kept his sleeping area comfortable without additional fuel. The fuel savings were measurable and significant. While other miners burned through 4 to 6 armloads of split wood per night during cold snaps, Kellerman used 2 to 3 armloads for the same period. Each armload represented 30 minutes of splitting and hauling in sub-zero conditions, so the reduction meant less exposure time and lower frostbite risk. More importantly, it meant his sleep wasn't interrupted by the need to feed a dying fire every few hours. The thermal mass principle also explained why his system maintained consistent temperatures, while standard setups experienced wild swings. Air temperature in a conventionally heated cabin could drop 30 degrees in 2 hours after a fire died down, forcing men to choose between getting up to reload or enduring increasingly dangerous cold until dawn. The stones beneath Kellerman's bunk released stored heat gradually, creating what engineers would later recognize as thermal stability. Harwick remained skeptical of the safety implications, but he couldn't argue with the mathematics of heat retention. "Your fuel count's better, I'll give you that," he admitted after watching Kellerman's wood consumption for 3 weeks. "But you're still routing smoke under your bed like some kind of underground chimney. One bad joint, one blocked flue, one downdraft, and you're breathing poison instead of sleeping warm." The concern was legitimate, and Kellerman addressed it with the same methodical approach he used for everything else. He checked joints daily, maintained clean-out access for soot removal, and monitored draft strength by watching smoke behavior at the exterior chimney. The system required more attention than a straight pipe, but the payoff in comfort and fuel efficiency made the extra maintenance worthwhile. As February 1899 approached, the distinction between heating air and heating mass was about to become a matter of survival rather than mere comfort. The record cold would test every heating system in the mining district, and the difference between wasted heat and captured heat would determine which men woke up with functional hands and which ones didn't wake up at all. The salvaged stovepipe sections came from Murphy's abandoned claim up the gulch, 3 lengths of 6-inch diameter pipe and one 90-degree elbow, all showing rust but structurally sound. Kellerman traded 2 days of weekend carpentry work to get them, knowing that new pipe cost more than most miners earned in a week. The discarded pieces had been sitting in a pile of scrap iron since Murphy pulled out in September, but they represented exactly what Kellerman needed to route his flue the long way around. The masonry channel took shape during 2 evenings after his regular shift and most of a Sunday afternoon when other men were drinking or playing cards. Kellerman started, by excavating beneath his existing bunk frame, digging a trench 10 inches deep and 18 inches wide that ran 6 feet along the length of his sleeping platform. The excavation had to be precise, deep enough to accommodate the pipe and stone lining, but not so deep that it compromised the cabin's log sill foundation. He lined the trench with field stone gathered from the creek bed, selecting flat pieces that would stack tightly and hold their position under thermal expansion. The stones went in dry-fitted first, then mortared with clay mud mixed with chopped grass for binding strength. The interior dimensions needed to match the stovepipe diameter with enough clearance for thermal expansion, so he built the channel interior to measure exactly 8 inches high by 12 inches wide, tight enough for efficient heat transfer, large enough to prevent pipe binding when metal expanded from heat. The most critical element was maintaining proper slope and draft characteristics through the horizontal run. Kellerman had learned from his greenhouse construction experience that even slight grade changes could create dead spots where gases pooled and draft stalled. He used a water level, a section of clear tubing filled with water, to ensure the entire channel maintained a gradual rise from the stove connection to the far wall exit. The total rise measured only 3 inches over 6 feet of run, but that gentle upward slope was enough to encourage natural convection flow. Installing the pipe required removing his entire sleeping platform temporarily, then working in the cramped space between floor joists and foundation stones. The horizontal section connected to his existing stove outlet with a standard T-joint, then ran through the masonry channel in 3 linked sections sealed with furnace cement. Each joint had to be tight enough to prevent gas leakage, but accessible enough for future maintenance and soot removal. The elbow joint posed the biggest challenge because it represented the system's most vulnerable failure point. Kellerman positioned it at the far end of the horizontal run, where the pipe turned upward to exit through the cabin wall. He wrapped the connection with extra furnace cement and built a removable stone cap that could be lifted for cleanout access. The final vertical section penetrated the log wall through a thimble, a metal sleeve that maintained safe clearance between hot pipe and combustible wood. Other miners gathered to watch the construction with mixtures of curiosity and skepticism. "Sleeping on a chimney," muttered Pete Carlson from the next bunk. "Might as well bed down in the firebox and be done with it." The men understood stoves and straight pipes, but the idea of routing hot gases under a sleeping surface struck them as fundamentally unnatural. Safety concerns dominated the conversations around the worksite. Walt Kuerner, who had worked as a mine safety inspector before joining the digging crews, pointed out every potential hazard. "Carbon monoxide's heavier than air," he warned. "You get a leak in that underground pipe, poison gas settles right where you're breathing all night. Find you dead come morning, and nobody will know why." Kellerman addressed each concern methodically, explaining his inspection routine and maintenance schedule. He had built clean-out access at both ends of the horizontal run, allowing him to rot out soot accumulation monthly. He planned to test all joints weekly with a candle flame to detect gas leaks. Most importantly, he had oversized the chimney exit to ensure strong upward draft that would prevent any backdraft into the cabin. The draft test came on a calm evening when Kellerman fired his completed system for the first time. He lit newspaper at the stove outlet and watched smoke travel through the entire flue path, timing its journey from firebox to exterior exit. The gases moved smoothly through the horizontal section, turned up the elbow joint without hesitation, and exited with enough force to disperse quickly in the outside air. Total travel time measured 45 seconds from ignition to clear exhaust, slow enough for heat transfer, fast enough for reliable draft. The thermal performance exceeded his calculations from the first night of operation. With his rebuilt sleeping platform positioned over the stone-lined channel, Kellerman could feel radiant heat through his mattress within 30 minutes of lighting the stove. The stones absorbed and stored thermal energy from the passing gases, then released that heat gradually over the following 8 to 10 hours. The system essentially turned his bed into a giant heating pad powered by waste heat that other setups threw away. The fuel consumption difference became apparent immediately. While his bunkmates loaded their stoves heavily at bedtime and woke to reload them twice during the night, Kellerman's extended flue path extracted so much heat from each firing that moderate fuel loads lasted until dawn. The The stones continued radiating warmth long after his fire died to coals, maintaining comfortable sleeping temperatures without constant feeding. Installation costs had been minimal by frontier standards: 47 field stones from the creek bed, 2 buckets of clay mud, half a day's wage for the salvaged pipe sections, and 3 days of his own labor. The materials would have cost $20 new, but resourceful scrounging reduced his cash outlay to less than $3. Most importantly, the work could be completed with common tools and skills available in any mining camp. As the system stabilized through its first weeks of operation, the daily temperature readings continued to show consistent 40-degree advantages over standard cabin heating. The innovation had transformed waste heat into survival advantage using principles any practical man could understand and replicate. But February 1899 was approaching with record cold that would test every heating system in the district beyond its design limits. February 11, 1899 brought the first warning that this cold snap would be different from ordinary winter weather. The temperature at the mining camp weather station dropped to 18 below zero and stayed there through the afternoon, unusual for the typically variable mountain climate that produced cold nights, followed by warming days. By evening, the mercury had fallen to 24 below, and the wind carried a bitter edge that cut through wool clothing like it was cotton sheeting. February 12th dawned at 31 below zero, with no sun visible through the gray overcast that had settled over the entire Rocky Mountain region. This was the leading edge of what meteorologists would later document as the Great Arctic Outbreak of 1899, a massive high-pressure system that brought record cold from Montana to central Texas and kept temperatures below zero across the plains for more than a week. In the mining camps of Colorado, it represented a survival test that would separate adequate heating systems from inadequate ones with lethal precision. Kellerman performed his standard temperature measurement routine at 4:30 that morning, sliding his thermometer under the wool blankets and waiting for the mercury to settle. 46 degrees in his sleep pocket. The cabin air thermometer by the door read 6 degrees above zero, a 40-degree difference that had become his daily proof of concept. But around the camp, other measurements told a grimmer story. Jim Harwick's straight pipe setup had required 3 reloads during the night to keep his water bucket from freezing solid. At dawn, his cabin air measured 4 degrees above zero, and frost covered the interior walls to a height of 3 feet 6 inches, a visual marker of how far the cold had penetrated despite continuous firing. Pete Carlson reported similar conditions, with ice forming on his blankets from exhaled breath that froze before it could escape the cabin's dead air spaces. The crisis deepened as the day progressed without any warming trend. Standard frontier wisdom held that even severe cold snaps moderated during daylight hours, allowing men to warm their cabins, split additional firewood, and prepare for the next night's battle. But February 12th never climbed above 15 below zero, and the afternoon brought falling snow that would add insulation problems to the existing temperature emergency. By evening, the mining camp faced a fuel consumption crisis that threatened to overwhelm their firewood supplies. Men who normally burned 4 armloads of split wood per night were loading 6 armloads and still struggling to maintain interior temperatures above freezing. The mathematics of survival had shifted against them. Each additional armload meant more time outside in lethal cold, splitting and hauling wood while exposed to wind chill that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes. Kellerman's system demonstrated its true value during this extended cold siege. His fuel consumption remained steady at 2 to 3 armloads per night because his thermal mass heating continued working efficiently even as exterior temperatures plunged to levels that overwhelmed direct heating systems. The stones beneath his bunk absorbed heat from the extended flue path and radiated that warmth for 10 to 12 hours, maintaining sleeping temperatures that kept him functional, while other miners fought numbness and frostbite risk. The contrast became stark during the midnight hours of February 12th into 13th, when exterior temperatures dropped to 35 below zero, the coldest reading ever recorded at the camp weather station. Harwick's cabin required constant fire maintenance, with reloads every 2 hours just to prevent complete interior freezing. Each reload meant getting up in a cabin that had already cooled to dangerous levels, handling frozen wood with numbed fingers, and working with fire when coordination was compromised by cold exposure. Kellerman slept through the entire night without adding wood to his stove. His afternoon firing heated the thermal mass sufficiently to carry him until dawn, when he woke to functional hands and clear thinking. His thermometer readings showed the same reliable differential, 44 degrees in his sleep pocket, 2 degrees above zero in the cabin air. While other men struggled with hypothermia symptoms and impaired judgment from sleep deprivation, he remained alert and capable. The camp's weather observer, a former railroad telegrapher named Samuel Morrison, documented the crisis with measurements that would later become part of the National Weather Service's historical record. February 13th brought the lowest temperature of the outbreak, 37 below zero at dawn, with sustained readings below 30 degrees below zero for 18 consecutive hours. Morrison noted that several miners showed signs of severe cold exposure, including confusion, slurred speech, and coordination problems that indicated dangerous core body temperature drops. The fuel consumption statistics told the story of a heating emergency that pushed conventional systems beyond their capabilities. Standard cabin setups were burning 8 to 10 armloads of wood per night and still failing to maintain safe interior temperatures. Men were choosing between sleep and fire maintenance, often staying awake in shifts to keep stoves burning rather than risk freezing to death during the night. Several miners moved their bedrolls directly beside their stoves, accepting smoke exposure as preferable to hypothermia risk. Kellerman's fuel consumption during the same period remained at 3 armloads per night, less than half the wood required by conventional heating systems. His thermal mass captured and stored enough heat from each firing to maintain comfortable sleeping conditions throughout the cold siege. The efficiency difference meant he could maintain his normal work schedule and physical condition while other miners fought exhaustion from interrupted sleep and constant fire tending. The frost line comparison provided visible evidence of heating system performance under extreme conditions. Standard cabins showed interior frost reaching 4 feet up the walls, with ice formation on bedding and clothing stored near bunk areas. Kellerman's cabin maintained its usual 1-foot frost line, and his sleeping area remained dry and comfortable despite the record cold outside. By February 14th, several miners had approached Kellerman quietly, asking for details about his underbed heating system. The mockery that had greeted his waste pipe construction had disappeared, replaced by desperate interest from men who had spent 3 nights fighting for survival against cold that conventional heating could not overcome. The crisis had proven his principle under the most demanding conditions possible, and the difference between adequate and inadequate heating had become a matter of life and death. Jim Harwick was the first to ask, approaching Kellerman privately on the morning of February 15th, when the temperature had finally climbed back to 10 below zero. The shift foreman, who had spent 2 months calling the underbed heating system dangerous nonsense, now wanted to understand exactly how it worked. "Show me the build," he said quietly, without his usual audience of skeptical miners. "Show me what makes it safe." Kellerman walked him through the construction principles methodically, starting with the thermal mass concept that differentiated his system from standard heating approaches. The key was capturing waste heat that conventional setups threw away, then storing that thermal energy in stone that would radiate warmth for hours after the fire died down. The extended flue path forced hot exhaust gases to transfer their heat into the masonry channel before escaping to the atmosphere, essentially turning discarded thermal energy into useful heating. The safety elements required careful attention to detail that separated functional installations from dangerous ones. Kellerman emphasized the importance of proper draft. The entire system depended on strong upward airflow that prevented any possibility of carbon monoxide backdraft into living space. He demonstrated his weekly joint inspection routine, showing how he tested connections with candle flames to detect gas leaks. The cleanout access at both ends of the horizontal run allowed monthly soot removal that kept the flue path clear and efficient. Within a week of the crisis, 3 other miners had begun building their own versions of the thermal mass heating system. Pete Carlson constructed a simplified variant using a masonry bench instead of an underbed channel, routing his extended flue through stones positioned alongside his bunk. Walt Kerner built a more elaborate installation that incorporated a small firebox positioned to heat both his sleeping area and a workspace where he repaired mining equipment during off-shift hours. Each adaptation taught lessons about the principles underlying successful thermal mass heating. Carlson's bench design worked effectively, but required more careful attention to stone positioning. Thermal energy needed direct contact with the sleeping surface to provide useful warmth. Kerner's dual-purpose system demonstrated that the same waste heat recovery concept could serve multiple functions, heating workspace as well as sleeping areas by routing the extended flue path through different thermal mass installations. The adoptions also revealed the importance of proper construction technique. Two miners who attempted to copy the system without understanding the draft requirements created dangerous installations that filled their cabins with smoke on the first firing. Kellerman spent an evening with each man, correcting flue sizing and joint sealing problems that could have resulted in carbon monoxide poisoning. The incidents reinforced that thermal mass heating required competent execution, not just imitation of visible components. By the end of February, 6 cabins in the Gulch had incorporated some version of extended flue heating, each adapted to specific space constraints and heating needs. The mining camp had effectively rediscovered principles that engineers would later recognize as fundamental to efficient heating system design, heat recovery, thermal mass storage, and waste energy utilization. What the miners called practical necessity, technical experts would eventually classify as advanced heating technology. The fuel consumption improvements were documented through the camp's supply records, which tracked firewood usage by cabin and week. Standard heating systems had consumed an average of 56 armloads of split wood per cabin during the February cold crisis. The thermal mass installations averaged 37 armloads for the same period, a reduction of nearly one-third. Over the remainder of the winter, the fuel savings continued at approximately the same ratio, representing significant cost reduction and reduced exposure time for men splitting and hauling wood. The comfort improvements proved equally measurable through temperature readings that several miners began taking after witnessing Kellerman's daily measurements. Standard cabin heating created wide temperature swings, from near freezing at dawn to uncomfortably hot immediately after firing, then back to dangerous cold within hours. The thermal mass systems maintained stable temperatures that varied only 10 to 15 degrees throughout the night, creating sleeping conditions that allowed uninterrupted rest. Samuel Morrison, the camp's weather observer, began documenting the heating innovations in his regular reports to the Territorial Weather Service. His correspondence described the thermal mass principle as a method of capturing waste heat from stove exhausts and storing said heat in masonry installations that continue radiating warmth long after fires die to coals. Morrison noted that the systems appeared to be based on traditional heating methods used in other cultures, adapted to the materials and conditions available in American mining camps. The technical principle that Kellerman had demonstrated connected to a much longer history of efficient heating design. The Korean ondol system had used underfloor flue networks for more than 2,000 years, routing hot gases from cooking fires through stone passages that warmed living and sleeping surfaces. Chinese Kang installations served similar functions, creating heated platforms that families used for sleeping, working, and social gathering. European masonry stoves incorporated thermal mass principles to capture and store heat from single daily firings, maintaining comfortable temperatures for 12 to 18 hours. What the mining camp had rediscovered through practical necessity was the fundamental difference between heating air and heating mass. Air-based heating systems worked by raising the temperature of cabin atmosphere, which escaped through gaps and cracks the moment heat input stopped. Thermal mass systems captured heat in stone and masonry that continued radiating warmth long after the original fire source was exhausted, creating stable temperature conditions that required less fuel input and provided superior comfort. The legacy of the February 1899 cold crisis extended beyond the immediate survival benefits. The thermal mass heating principles that Kellerman introduced to the mining camp spread throughout the district over the following seasons, adapted and improved by men who understood the value of fuel efficiency and reliable warmth. The techniques represented practical engineering that solved real problems using available materials and traditional knowledge adapted to frontier conditions. When winter tried to kill them, the miners learned that they didn't need more fire. They needed less wasted heat. The 40-degree difference that Kellerman's thermometer had measured every morning became the margin between survival and death, between adequate rest and exhausted struggle, between practical heating and dangerous fuel consumption. The innovation had turned waste into warmth and mockery into method that would preserve lives through countless cold nights ahead.